What is a sigil?
A sigil is a compressed, you could call it a compressed thought form, or you could call it a concentrated idea. It's typically speaking, it is a sentence or a word or an idea that is brought down into a certain um, into a more compact form of itself. I'm looking around trying to find one that I can show without blasting the audience with
There
energy.
was one
But
on that candle.
yeah, so this is an ancestral sigil that I've created, and it has my dad's, my grandfather's, and my great grandfather's, as well as my grandma and my great grandmother's initials, all packed down into this sigil. So that's yeah, good point.
That's cool. And what method did you use to make that one, and what methods are there?
So the method that I used for that one was the Austin Osman Spar or Spare deconstructionist method, which is where, and I actually have a video of this. But it's you take a word like say health or healing, and you basically turn it into one letter. You make all of those letters into one letter so that you can charge that sigil. And if you'd like, we can get into the process of charging a sigil. But I will address the other major uh, ways to create a sigil. The second one, most common, is probably the Kamea method. And this involves the use of magic squares. And what makes them magical is they contain numbers. So, for instance, the Kamea of Saturn. Saturn relates to the number three and the tradition that I have learned the most from. So I would create a 3 by 3 grid and I would put the numbers 1 through 9 in them, but you arrange them. What makes it magical is that you arrange them in a way that every single row, column, and diagonal adds up to the same number. In this case, the number 15. And then you attribute letters to each of those numbers through a certain relatively complex technique. And then you trace the word on that sigil. Or sorry, you trace that word on the square until you have your sigil. That's probably the most complicated method. The next method is perhaps the easiest, and I call it the wheel method. And actually, I'll just demonstrate this here. So if you imagine that you had an alphabet of 16 letters and you created a wheel like this that gave you 16 sections, and then you um, started, like, say, right here, this was the letter. You basically, sorry, trying to get the light out of there. You go from one letter into the next until you have your word, and it's sigilized. It's super simple, but it's super effective.
Cool, cool. And how can you charge them?
So the major ways of charging them are either going into trance and gazing at the sigil until it does what's called flashing. And what that looks like is it'll sort of reverse, like the black will become white and the white will become black. Another way is to just go into a state of so-called gnosis or trance until you forget what it's kind of like you forget what you're doing or you remember what you're doing, and then you come back, and basically that's a sign that you went to the subconscious or unconscious place in your mind, and then you brought it back, so you sent that sigil through the veil essentially. There's also what most people refer to as self-love. If you look into sigils enough, you'll figure out what that means. Or partner, like having an act of love with your partner, and during the moment of rapture or ecstasy, so to speak, you only have that sigil in mind and you visualize the outcome sort of happening and feeling the way that you would feel if you were to receive that outcome. Those are probably the two major ways. Another way that I like to do is you can use the elements to charge your sigil for you. So if it relates to passion and change, as my candle pops in the corner, you can burn the sigil with fire. If it relates to intuition and receptivity, you can dissolve the sigil in water. If it relates to air, you can get some sort of biodegradable material, or like a bay leaf, for instance, and write the intention of the sigil on the bay leaf and then tear it up and let it fly into the wind. Or if it relates to earth and healing or prosperity, you can bury the bay leaf or whatever you've written on into the earth and let it sort of integrate that way. Those are all pretty good ways to charge a sigil.